He was betrayed, judged, sentenced, and executed. But to who really killed Jesus of Nazareth? The real answer is something neither Jews nor Christians like to face, and it changes everything you thought you knew about the cross. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is a historical fact, accepted not only by Christians and Jews, but also by secular scholars. Yet, what most people fail to realize is that his death wasn't just the tragic end of a passionate religious life. It was the breaking point between two worlds. It all began in the 1st century AD, when Christianity, originally a Jewish movement, began claiming that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. But for traditional Judaism, that claim was not only false, it was blasphemy. That's where the split between the two faiths began, a divide that shaped centuries of theology, conflict, and radically different interpretations of the same story. And at the center of that divide lies the very question this video is built around: who was truly responsible for Jesus' death? In Jesus' time, the Jewish people lived under Roman occupation. Rome allowed a certain level of religious freedom, but that tolerance had strict limits. Any perceived threat to imperial order was crushed without hesitation. Within that context, the Jewish leadership, made up of Pharisees, Sadducees, and the high priestly class, held significant religious and social influence, but always under the watchful eye of Roman authorities. These religious elites had their own internal power struggles, but they stood united whenever someone threatened their authority. Jesus, with his growing popularity, his sharp critiques of religious hypocrisy, and his bold claim to be the Son of God, became exactly that kind of threat. He drew crowds, performed signs, and challenged the very foundations of the religious system. To the Jewish leaders, he wasn't just a rebel preacher, he was a threat to the delicate balance they had managed to maintain with Rome. From the Roman point of view, Judaism was just one of many tolerated religions. As long as it didn't stir rebellion, it could be left alone. But the talk of a king of the Jews, even if meant spiritually, sounded politically dangerous. Any sign of a messianic movement could be interpreted as the early stages of revolt, and for Rome, rebellion was a red line. Jesus was a threat to both sides. To the Sanhedrin, he challenged doctrinal control. To Rome, he looked like just another insurgent leader, one more revolutionary stirring unrest in a volatile region. Tension was inevitable. The stage was set for a showdown between faith, authority, and power, and it was in this climate that the Jewish leaders made a pivotal decision to put Jesus on trial for blasphemy. But how could they do this without violating the restrictions imposed by Roman rule? The Sanhedrin was the highest religious authority in Second Temple Judaism, a council of 70 elders, including Pharisees, Sadducees, and the high priest. It acted as a court that handled religious and civil disputes within the limits tolerated by Rome. It was this council that summoned Jesus to be interrogated. The formal charge was blasphemy. When Jesus declared himself the Son of God, the response from the religious leaders was swift and severe. According to Luke 22:70-71, they interpreted his words as a direct violation of the law. Leviticus 24:16 states that anyone who blasphemes the name of God must be put to death. For the members of the Sanhedrin, this wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was about protecting the sacred identity of Israel's faith. But there was a problem. Jews were forbidden from carrying out capital punishment without Roman approval. Even if the Sanhedrin found Jesus guilty, they couldn't legally execute him. So they made a strategic move. They brought the case to the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Blasphemy, of course, meant nothing to the Romans. It held no legal weight under Roman law, so the Sanhedrin shifted the accusation. Instead of claiming Jesus had offended God, they said he had declared himself king. That, in Roman ears, was a political threat, potentially the spark of rebellion. This change in narrative was calculated. It was the only way to make the Romans take Jesus seriously as a problem worth eliminating. From the start, Jesus' trial was tainted by a mix of theological interests and political maneuvering. The Sanhedrin wasn't just seeking religious justice. They wanted to preserve their power, maintain public order, and silence the man who openly exposed their hypocrisy. But if the Sanhedrin didn't have the authority to carry out an execution, then who did order the crucifixion? This is where Pontius Pilate steps in, a man caught between truth and political convenience. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea, appointed by Rome to keep order and ensure taxes flowed back to the empire. He wasn't known for compassion or fairness, but for his strict, often ruthless rule. Still, the gospel accounts portray Pilate as hesitant when it came to the case of Jesus. According to the Gospels, Pilate questioned Jesus and found no fault in him. In John 18:38, he says, "I find no basis for a charge against him." That statement reveals something crucial. In Roman terms, Jesus wasn't a political rebel. He wasn't rallying the people to take up arms, nor was he posing a direct threat to Caesar's authority. By Roman law, he should have been set free. But Pilate faced a volatile crowd, stirred up by the leaders of the Sanhedrin, demanding a death sentence. He knew that any decision would carry consequences. If he released Jesus, he risked being seen as sympathetic to a man some labeled dangerous. If he condemned him, he would be executing an innocent man purely for political convenience. Looking for a way out, Pilate offered a traditional gesture, the release of one prisoner during Passover. The choice was between Jesus and Barabbas, a man already convicted of insurrection. The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate famously washed his hands before the people, a symbolic act meant to absolve himself of responsibility. But in the end, it was Pilate who gave the order for crucifixion. Pilate's decision reflects a timeless dilemma of power, knowing what is right but yielding to pressure in the name of political stability. Jesus wasn't crucified because justice demanded it, but because fear and convenience prevailed. But did the crowd really choose freely, or were they manipulated by those who had already made up their minds? The image of a crowd shouting, "Crucify him," has echoed through Christian memory for centuries. In Mark 15:13, the scene is blunt. The people reject Jesus and demand Barabbas. But to truly understand this moment, we have to ask, who exactly was this crowd? And what led them to make that choice? Just days earlier, this very crowd had welcomed Jesus with palm branches and cries of "Hosanna." They hailed him as king when he entered Jerusalem. So how, in such a short time, did they turn against him? The answer lies in the influence of the religious leaders. The Sanhedrin had already decided Jesus had to be eliminated, but they knew convincing Pilate wouldn't be enough. They needed to stir public outrage, to create a wave of pressure that would justify the death sentence. The Gospels suggest that the priests actively incited the people. They twisted the narrative, portraying Jesus not as a teacher or prophet, but as a threat to their faith and national security. It's important to remember that Jerusalem during Passover was packed with people. Many of those who had celebrated Jesus' arrival were likely gone or far from the judgment scene by then. The crowd standing before Pilate wasn't necessarily the same crowd that shouted "Hosanna" days earlier. It was likely a smaller group, gathered quickly, surrounded by tension and easily influenced. This crowd wasn't thinking clearly. They were driven by fear, by religious pressure, and by leaders who had already determined Jesus' fate. In moments like this, the loudest voices win. The crowd didn't reflect. They reacted. And amid all those voices and agendas, Christianity presents a radically different interpretation. that no one truly killed Jesus because he chose to give himself up. In Christian theology, the crucifixion was not just a tragic injustice, it was the fulfillment of a divine plan. The New Testament teaches that Jesus willingly died for the sins of humanity. He wasn't merely a victim of corrupt leaders or an oppressive empire. He offered himself. In John 10:18, Jesus says, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." This completely reframes the question of guilt. Jesus wasn't caught off guard. He wasn't a helpless victim. He knew what was coming, and he chose to go through it. His death is understood as a substitutionary sacrifice, the innocent dying in place of the guilty. This perspective is echoed in Romans 5:8. Christ died for us while we were still sinners. The message is clear. The crucifixion wasn't ultimately about punishment. It was about reconciliation between God and humanity. That's why Christianity doesn't focus on assigning historical blame. It focuses on the spiritual meaning behind the event. From this view, the cross isn't a symbol of defeat, it's a symbol of redemption. By giving himself up, Jesus was fulfilling what had been prophesied centuries earlier in Isaiah 53. He was pierced for our transgressions. However, this explanation hasn't always been properly understood. Throughout history, the idea that Jesus' death had a greater spiritual purpose was often ignored or distorted, opening the door to unfair accusations that deeply damaged the relationship between Christians and Jews. This misinterpretation fueled centuries of persecution, hatred, and violence. Turning a spiritual event into a collective accusation against an entire people had devastating consequences. Over time, the question, "Who killed Jesus?" became a pointed accusation, directed not at individuals, but at the entire Jewish people. This oversimplified and theologically flawed narrative took root, and for generations, many Christians held the Jews collectively responsible for the crucifixion, a belief that bred hostility and justified persecution. Even in the early centuries of Christianity, this narrative was used to draw a sharp line between the new faith and its Jewish roots. As the church sought to define itself, it often emphasized Jewish guilt as a way to highlight the new covenant in contrast to the old. Over time, this distorted theology became the foundation for discriminatory laws, forced expulsions, massacres, and brutal episodes like the pogroms in Eastern Europe. During the Middle Ages, the charge of deicide, the belief that the Jews killed God, was used to justify inquisitions, forced conversions, and large-scale persecution. This narrative ignored a crucial fact. The authors of the Gospels, the Apostles, and the very first generation of Christians were themselves Jewish. Christianity was born from the heart of Judaism, and the early Christian communities still practiced many Jewish traditions. Forgetting this context led to the reinforcement of dangerous stereotypes. The image of the guilty Jew became a symbol of betrayal and evil in many Christian cultures, a tragic distortion of the Gospel's original message. Even centuries later, these ideas still echo in conversations and mindsets that should have long been left behind. According to the biblical Christian view, the death of Jesus cannot be blamed on any single ethnic group. Christian theology teaches that he died for the sins of all humanity, and that, in a spiritual sense, everyone shares responsibility. Reducing the crucifixion to a matter of historical or ethnic blame misses the very heart of the Christian faith. In the face of so many layers, religious, political, spiritual, and historical, one final question remains: who then killed Jesus? Answering that question takes more than pointing fingers. The Gospel accounts show multiple players involved. Religious leaders rejected him. Romans carried out the execution. The crowd shouted for it. But above all, Jesus gave himself willingly. To reduce this moment to an ethnic or political accusation is to lose sight of the spiritual meaning of the crucifixion. The New Testament teaches that everything unfolded according to a greater plan. Acts 2:23 states that Jesus was handed over by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and yet was killed by the hands of wicked men. In other words, there was human responsibility, but also divine sovereignty. There is no single guilty party. There is a complex scene where fear, power, religion, and politics collide, but the ultimate purpose was not destruction, it was redemption. The cross was not the end, it was the means. And in that sense, Jesus didn't just die because of us, he died for us. Blaming a people is not only unjust, it is theologically false. Spiritually, we all share in this story. And according to Christian belief, it's precisely that awareness that opens the door to grace and reconciliation with God. John 10:18, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." Acts 2:23, "This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death." Isaiah 53, "He was pierced for our transgressions." If this video helped you better understand this deeply sensitive topic, we invite you to watch our next video. Isaiah 53, Jesus or the Jewish Suffering Servant, where we explore how Jews and Christians interpret one of the most cited prophecies in the Bible in radically different ways. See you in the next episode, where we continue examining the scriptures with respect, depth, and truth.